So here's the thing. I love SJM books, I have a psych degree, and an acting diploma. Put it all together and what have you got? Bibbidi bobbidi. The three Archeron sisters are the sympathetic nervous system responses to stressors of fight, flight, and freeze, plus an additional fourth character at the end with a surprise fourth stress response. Before we get started, I want to say a quick hello and welcome all. This is Eclectic Kelpie, where we dive into the treasure trove of fantastical media. And if you wish that you could wake up in the night court and hang out with the inner circle, then jump into that subscribe button to be dunked into the cauldron and join us on all of our adventures. Now, with all of that being said, let's jump into the episode. Welcome to my first video. First off, big spoiler warning for all 5 books in the ACOTAR series. I will be using these books to highlight behaviors that support my hypothesis of each Archeron sister plus the extra one at the end being indicative of which stress response they embody the best. To start off, let's just begin really quickly with some operational definitions for the concepts that we're going to be talking about today. So, for sympathetic nervous system, the sympathetic nervous system is a network of nerves that activate when the body or mind is under duress as a survival tool. Think epinephrine, or the colloquial version of that is adrenaline. A stress response is a physiological and psychological response to a perceived threat, also known as the fight-flight response. This was coined by Walter B. Cannon in 1927. And the fight-flight response is considered behaviors that occur as a response to a perceived threat. Flight is to run away or retreat, and fight is obviously to stand and fight back. And then freeze is motor and vocal inhibition, so just kind of a complete shutdown of a response. Think like possums, where they just play dead. And lastly, fawn, which is pleasing or appeasing a perceived threat in order to minimize or avoid distress. Now, with all of that out of the way, let's get started. Let's start off with the most straightforward Archeron sister, in my opinion. I would say Elain is fairly clearly the freeze response. Though she is the sister that we spend the least amount of time with, I think that her behavior is indicative of freeze when she is presented with adverse stimuli, just meaning negative experiences. I'm excited to see how she grows and develops, though, in her own book when that eventually comes out, hopefully soon. My first piece of evidence for Elain being representative of the freeze response comes from Mist and Fury, chapter 65, when she is first being dumped into the cauldron. When we first see Elain and Nesta being hauled to the cauldron in chapter 65 of Mist and Fury, Elain is just standing there quietly sobbing. She doesn't move, she's not doing anything, whereas Nesta is being described as looking disheveled, as if she fought like a wildcat. So, Elaine's just standing there. The next piece of evidence comes from page 603 in chapter 65 again. And as everyone is yelling for the King of Hybern to not shove the Archeron sisters into the cauldron, Elain yields step after step towards the cauldron. So she's kind of just being passive and she's not having any action. So the guards are pushing her towards the cauldron, she's just kind of going. She's not reacting, she's not trying to run, she's not trying to fight back, she's just doing what they are pushing her to do, quite literally. Further, Elain stays quietly motionless on the floor. This is exhibited in pages 605 to 607, where she lays motionless on the floor as Lucien goes down and gives her his jacket to wrap around her body, but she just stays there silently. Water pours forth. Lucien hoists Elain into his arms and out of the way. Yeah, we see Elain just laying on the floor. Not incredibly responsive. And the last piece of evidence that I have for Elain is on page 608, where Nesta is trying to engage with Elain and trying to get her to focus back in the present moment, where Elain is just standing there and Nesta grips her upright, running her hands over Elaine's face, shoulders, and hair. Elain, 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 Elain. She is sobbing. Elain does not respond. She simply looks over Nesta's shoulder and is looking at Lucien. And of course she is stunned and shocked to discover that Lucien is her mate, but she is essentially not responsive and is just standing still, struggling to process. But this is why I believe that Elain is representative of the freeze response. Now, this one might be a little bit contentious, but stay with me here. Because despite Nesta exhibiting more combative behavior, her reasoning behind her aggression is to run away. We see her continue to go deeper into herself and retreat and sort of turn off her emotions in order to keep herself safe, even though that manifests as lashing out. I believe that because she is fleeing from the adverse stimuli with her behavior, even though her behavior is more aggressive, her intention is to flee, so I think that she embodies the flight response. Through her narrative in A Court of Silver Flames, we see that her intention is always to push people away. We can see this very explicitly demonstrated in chapter 50 while she's talking with Cassian about how she's trying to run away from her past and from her feelings. So in chapter 50 of A Court of Silver Flames, on page 504, Nesta is discussing how she can't be around fire because it sounds too much like the sound of her dad's snapping neck in the end of A Court of Wings and Ruin. So, as she's explaining to Cassian, she says, "My father's death, it's the reason I can't stand fires. The logs, they crack. It's the sound like breaking bones, like your father's neck. Yes. That's what I hear. I don't know how I'll ever not hear his neck snapping when I'm near a fire. It's torture." She constantly throughout the book cannot be around fire. She is fleeing from the negative stimuli that she's experiencing. So that is one of the reasons why I believe that Nesta is exhibiting a flight response. We also see on page 484, after Nesta has told Feyre that she is going to die from childbirth, she literally runs away from the situation. Nesta didn't respond, didn't know what to say or do with herself. She simply turned on her heels and ran from the apartment. So rather than continuously trying to deal with the conflict or deal with conflict resolution, she just exits the situation and runs away from that negative stimuli. And then finally for Nesta, we see at the very beginning from page 12, Nesta is purposefully trying to not engage with her own. So from the beginning of Silver Flames, we can see that Nesta is trying to do everything that she can to not have to live in her own mind and in her own memory. She's constantly running from her negative experiences. So on page 12, it's Nesta didn't remember the name of the man who was in her apartment. She's using substances and she's using sex in order to escape from having to deal with what her problems actually are, and using substances and using external means of managing her internal struggles. So she's running away from what's going on rather than facing it and dealing with it. She's constantly trying to push away from dealing with her negative circumstances. So to conclude, I think that Nesta embodies the flight response more than the other two. And finally, out of the three sisters, Feyre. So as the main character, of course, for the first three books, we get to see Feyre's perspective and her internal dialogue and how she's processing conflict at the time that she's experiencing it. In fact, Feyre displays that majority of the time she's not even afraid of the conflict. She jumps straight into the perceived threats and immediately goes into the fight response when adverse situations present themselves. We see it at the very beginning of this whole series in ACOTAR on chapter 4, page 33 to 34. Immediately, Tamlin's beast pops into their house. And she immediately jumps into action. So Feyre's inner dialogue explains, "But I didn't have room for terror, wouldn't give an inch of space, despite my heart's wild pounding in my ears. Somehow I wound up in front of my sisters, even as the creature reared onto its hind legs and bellowed through its maw full of fangs." Immediately, as soon as there was trouble, Feyre jumped in to be in front of her sisters. She didn't hesitate. She went to attack back, and then the scene goes on and she's actively throwing kitchen knives and stuff at Tamlin's beast, or Tamlin in beast form. She immediately goes into fight. That's how we meet her, is her in fight response. As well as all of chapter 36 of ACOTAR as well, we see Feyre fighting the worm, and her response to this creature coming to try and kill her is to fight. She fights hard, she makes it out alive. That's her priority, is to fight to survive. And she does it, and she displays the fight response very clearly, I think, in through the whole series. But yes, also in chapter 36 when she's fighting the Midgard worm. Moving on to A Court of Mist and Fury, Feyre, during the Battle of Valaris, when Hybern comes and attacks and she's facing down the Adder, on page 565, just at the top, she says, or she thinks, "If I die defending them, defending the small place in the world where art thrived, then so be it." She is immediately prepared to fight to the death. She is prepared to go down with her people. She is so instantly ready to face combat and face these trials. And then all of chapter 59, when she is facing the Adder and she creates the water wolves and all that stuff, like, she's prepared to fight, and she goes as hard as she possibly can to be able to defend her people. She makes it very clear that she is ready to fight to defend her people at all times. And even in smaller ways, Feyre has made it very clear that she's ready to fight and speak up when things are not fair. She will fight for people and fight for people she cares about, even just in the simple situation on page 92 of Mist and Fury. She is going against Tamlin in front of his court and asking, why not help her replenish the pond? Like, why not? In reference to talking about the tithe, and he's being really strict about having to tax his people, and she's bringing these things up and being combative and having conflict, and she's not scared to have these kinds of conflict. She is prepared to speak up against things that she thinks is not fair, and so her ability and propensity for going into conflict situations is also very clear, not just in physical combat, but also in reference to just like daily conflict, where she's happy to have those arguments and fight for what she believes. And finally, Feyre was fighting for her family since their mother had passed away and they lost their fortune. She was the one going out and being the hunter. She was the one who was going out and doing the positive actions. Positive just meaning like active, and out doing the things. She was the hunter for her family. She was the one who was going out and selling and working to make sure that her family didn't go without. I think it's pretty clear Feyre is the fight response, and she is constantly demonstrating that she will go to the mat anytime that she needs to protect the people that she cares about, and also herself. So Feyre is the fight response. Of course, all of the sisters have the capacity to be any of the responses throughout their experiences through the series, but I think that these ones just embody what their default responses are. So of course we see Nesta fight all the time. She's very combative and very externalized. And of course Feyre freezes when Tamlin locks her in the mansion in the Spring Court in Mist and Fury, and she like goes inside herself and like just crumples on the floor. But I think that as a general thing, Nesta being flight, Feyre being fight, and Elain being freeze are sort of their default responses. And finally, the surprise character at the end, I think that Lucien is a fawn response. Through the series, we see Lucien being complicit in the negative behaviors of those he sees as his superiors, and also in the poor actions of his friends and people that he sees as having a power imbalance with him. So his response with Tamlin is, of course, always to mitigate and minimize the impact of Tamlin's negative actions, and he tries to appease him at every turn. It's important to note that Lucien sees that he owes something to Tamlin, so his need to appease and his need to sort of like taper off Tamlin's explosive episodes is probably also how he had to deal with the Autumn Court, but he sees Tamlin as being sort of a rescuer figure, so it also kind of like helps contribute to his appeasing go-to response to the negative stimuli that is Tamlin. We see this very clearly when Lucien is complicit in Tamlin having that collaborative relationship with Hybern and having an alliance. Lucien doesn't really do anything or say anything that we see on page, at least, but yeah, he does go along with Tamlin making poor choices like that. We also see Lucien having appeasing and sort of like downplaying the negative responses in order to kind of like de-escalate the situation and just kind of like appease and mitigate. We can see this on page 29 when Lucien is sort of like shoving off Feyre's concerns in favor of not having to bring more conflict towards Tamlin. So Lucien just says to Feyre, give him time, Feyre, let's get through the wedding, then the tithe next month, and then we'll see what we can do about the rest. So rather than wanting to allow Feyre to have her response, he sort of like mitigates and pleases and shoves it down for Tamlin's sake to ensure that Tamlin does not have to deal with more conflict and doesn't have more negativity placed onto him. We also see on page 123 of Mist and Fury, when Feyre is being locked inside of the house and Tamlin and Lucien are about to leave, Lucien says to Feyre, just be patient, Feyre, please. I'll see what I can do, I'll try again. So he's trying to, again, use that, shoving it down, mitigating the situation, pleasing and appeasing, like, don't worry about it, I'll take care of it, trying to mitigate the situation instead of just allowing the conflict to happen. He's trying to decrease it. And not in a healthy way, not in a let's de-escalate the situation, but in a dismissive kind of way where he's not addressing the problem, he's trying to get rid of the problem with kind words. So I think that Lucien is very representative of the fawn, the please and appease kind of stress response. And that was the 3 Archeron sisters plus Lucien's sympathetic nervous system responses to stressors. These, of course, are all just my observations and opinions, but please feel free to share your thoughts in the comments down below. Thank you all so much for watching. Everything with love, and we'll see you next time in the Treasure Trove. Bye!